I apologize. I didn't have my sound on. So we're going to start again. Hi, my name is Connor Moran. I just spoke for about a minute and a half without any sound. And I am delighted to be welcoming Yaa Gyasi and Ainehi Edoro here for the first event of our 2020 fall calendar to celebrate the publication of Transcendent Kingdom. Ainehi Edoro is a professor here at the UW-Madison and also the founder and publisher of Brittle Paper, which is an African literature blog celebrating its 10th anniversary this year. So congratulations, Ainehi. And Yaa Gyasi is one of the country's best novelists. And we're really excited for this conversation tonight. As always, I'd like to thank Madison Public Library, the Madison Public Library Foundation, and all of our sponsors for helping us keep these events free and open to the public. Additionally, one of our sponsors, Cheryl Weston, gave a bequest that allows us to buy 150 free copies of the book tonight to be distributed. I will put a link up at the bottom. All you have to do is sign up, and then our book selling partners at A Room of One's Own will send those books out to you this week. So thank you so much. Ainehi, Yaa, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
About this novel, Transcendent Kingdom, what it's about, and then she's going to read a little bit from it, and then
yes, wonderful. Thank you so much, Ainehi, for sharing this space with me. Thank you to the Wisconsin Book Festival for having me. And yeah, I'm very excited to be here with all of you today. So thank you for sharing your time tonight. So Transcendent Kingdom is a novel about a young woman named Gifty who is getting her doctorate in neuroscience. And she studies addiction and depression. And it's at a time when her own mother, who is suffering from depression, comes to stay with her. So she finds herself taking care of her mother while working toward her final thesis, while also reflecting back on her childhood, particularly the years that led up to her beloved older brother's passing from a heroin overdose. So it's a book that attempts to reckon with relationships with addiction and depression, with the opioid epidemic in America. And yeah, I will read just from the very beginning of the novel, so no spoilers.
Good.
Whenever I think of my mother, I picture a queen-sized bed with her lying in it, a practiced stillness filling the room. For months on end, she colonized that bed like a virus. The first time when I was a child, and then again when I was a graduate student. The first time I was sent to Ghana to wait her out. While there, I was walking through Kejitia Market with my aunt when she grabbed my arm and pointed. Look, a crazy person, she said in Twi. Do you see? A crazy person. I was mortified. My aunt was speaking so loudly. And
hold on for a second.
Sorry, Connor, I think your mic is on.
Connor?
I'll start that paragraph over.
Okay, yeah.
The world of virtual. I was mortified. My aunt was speaking so loudly, and the man, tall with dust caked into his dreadlocks, was within earshot. I see, I answered in a low hiss. The man continued past us, mumbling to himself as he waved his hands about in gestures that only he could understand. My aunt nodded, satisfied, and we kept walking past the hordes of people gathered in that agoraphobia-inducing market until we reached the stall where we would spend the rest of the morning attempting to sell knockoff handbags. In my 3 months there, we sold only 4 bags. Even now, I don't completely understand why my aunt singled the man out to me. Maybe she thought there were no crazy people in America, that I had never seen one before. Or maybe she was thinking about my mother, about the real reason I was stuck in Ghana that summer, sweating in a stall with an aunt I hardly knew while my mother healed at home in Alabama. I was 11, and I could see that my mother wasn't sick, not in the ways that I was used to. I didn't understand what my mother needed healing from. I didn't understand, but I did. And my embarrassment at my aunt's loud gesture had as much to do with my understanding as it did with the man who had passed us by. His name. What I saw was my mother's face, still as lake water, the pastor's hand resting gently on her forehead, his prayer, a light hum that made the room buzz. I'm not sure I know what crazy looks like, but even today, when I hear the word, I picture a split screen, the dreadlocked man in Kejitia on one side, my mother lying in bed on the other. I think about how no one at all reacted to that man in the market, not in fear or disgust, nothing, save my aunt who wanted me to look. He was, it seemed to me, at perfect peace, even as he gesticulated wildly, even as he mumbled. But my mother, in her bed, infinitely still, was wild inside. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Yeah, that's one of my favorite moments. That very last bit where we see these two faces placed side by side, and you draw this correspondence between both of them, right? That what may seem obvious about what differentiates them is actually not, is something else. And you do that all through the novel. You know, you have this really interesting juxtapositions, you know, between the mice and your brother and Gifty's brother, or between the mice and you and Gifty's mom, or between science and religion. Like there's this kind of puzzle about how can we complicate these two things that seem in opposition but they are not.
Right.
Like why are you drawn to that particular way of reasoning through things?
Well, I think that I'm drawn to it because we often think about things in binaries. We think about things as being necessarily opposed to one another. So as you mentioned, like religion and science as being incompatible. There's a moment in this novel where a friend of Gifty's asks her, who is also a scientist or scientifically minded, asks her if she believes in evolution. And Gifty says, well, yes, of course I believe in evolution. And the woman is incredulous. She says, how, you know, creationism and evolution are diametrically opposed. And what Gifty says is, I think we are made of stardust and God made the stars. So I was interested in this idea that there are people who are rejecting these binaries that we place, that we kind of use to frame our world. And Gifty is a person who is incredibly comfortable, I think, within this opposition. She's incredibly comfortable thinking about things as existing on a continuum, thinking about things as existing in conversation with one another, not in opposition to one another. And I think she has that inclination because she herself is a person who exists in this kind of realm. As an immigrant, as a Black person who grew up in a predominantly white area, she finds herself in these places in her own personal life where the idea of being kind of at odds doesn't encapsulate her own personal experiences. So I think she's given toward thinking about the world in a little more kind of spectrum-minded way.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And just thinking about another opposition or juxtaposition, your first novel and this novel.
Yes.
I mean, I couldn't help, because I think maybe it's something it has to do with publishing your second book after your first book. Everybody can't just help but place the first book in relation to the second.
Yeah.
And they are very different kinds of books. Homegoing explores history and violence. You know, it's this kind of grand epic narrative, transatlantic, like this bustling, sprawling cast of characters. Like literally your head is swirling with meeting all these new people all the time. It's fragmented. It's gorgeous in that sense. This is a different project, it seems to me. How would you articulate, you know, the shift that takes place with this novel in comparison to Homegoing?
Yeah, absolutely. From like multiple craft perspectives, these books are completely different. As you said, Homegoing covers centuries, it covers continents, it has 14 point of view characters, and it's just a novel, I think, that is ambitious in the kind of macro sense of the word. It's interested in looking in as many different areas as possible. By contrast, Transcendent Kingdom is in the first person. It follows a single woman, her family, her one family, over the course of about 30 years. The front story, the present action of the story, takes place over probably about 2 weeks. Yeah. So it's not even really that expansive in that regard. And yes, as you say, the books are so very different, and it took me a while to really ease into the intimacy of this novel, which required such different tools from me as a writer. But I think that was part of the pleasure of working on this book after having a book like Homegoing, and it was also it was obviously my first book. I wrote it when I was really young, and it was so successful that I think it took me a while to like give myself permission to try something again, anything again, to like return to a sense of quiet, just that place of stillness that I think writers really need in order to write. But I think because this book was so different, and was asking very different things of me, it kind of released some of that pressure, because I couldn't compare the books even for myself. They were just such different projects that it allowed me to set aside Homegoing, set aside thinking about Homegoing, and just tackle this book and ask what this book required of me, what story this was trying to tell. And I think there was a kind of freedom in that.
Yeah. I mean, what story is it trying to tell? Like, what are the stakes in dissecting the intimate lives of an African family in the South, right? And just giving space for the little happenings in their world to take place, right? Because sometimes I feel as if, especially in within the space, right? There's a way that that's the kind of stillness and the intimate aspects of Black lives are not things that people want to see. They want to see, like, you know, dramatic, grand, you know, very genre-ish types of things. But you slow things down and say, we're just going to literally look at these people in their most intimate and still and little places. What would you say is the stakes of exploring that type of narrative at this moment?
Yeah, well, as you say, I don't think that we see a lot of stories, or I should say, we don't privilege a lot of stories where Black people are experiencing just kind of everydayness. I was thinking about, you know, all of these books historically in America that have won, the Black writers who have won Pulitzer Prizes in America historically have been writing about Jim Crow or slavery. Same with Oscar-winning Best Picture films. What we privilege often is the kind of the grand, the violent, and also I think the historical, because there's
Right.
this ease with saying the problems that Black people endure are in the distant past and have nothing to do with what their lives look like today, what our lives look like today. And so there was something really important for me about setting something in the present, again, coming off a book like Homegoing, that took this macro view of institutionalized racism. Well, here we have institutionalized racism, absolutely, but we have it on this intimate scale. So you are seeing the way that it impacts a person's everyday lived experience. You see these moments where Gifty is internalizing that racism. You see these moments where she is really buying into Black respectability politics, this idea that the way to overcome the racism that she's experiencing is to just be twice as good. That all of those things that we kind of accept, that are just like a part of the ether, that we don't often see interrogated in, again, the everyday intimate stories of Black life, are on display here. So what Gifty is going through is not very uncommon, but it's not a story that I had seen, particularly from the immigrant perspective. And so that was another thing that was important to me. It is a book, I think, that is really interested, as Homegoing was, in thinking about what trauma does to a person. Like how do we live with our traumas that oftentimes have nothing to do with ourselves, traumas that our parents carry, that our grandparents carried. How do we make a life for ourselves within that trauma? And the other thing that I think this book is asking is, how do we make sense of a life, and of a world in which senseless things happen? So Gifty is a character who has experienced loss after loss after loss, sometimes really physical losses, like her father going back to Ghana or her brother's passing. But sometimes a kind of emotional loss, a distance. Her mother is not available to her in ways that we expect mothers to be available to their daughters, to their children. And so she's a person who is trying to grapple with that loss, which itself feels like a presence in her life. And I wanted to show that, show how that works, and how a person continues to make a life despite the struggles, despite the kind of, again, macro pressures that are weighing down on them, just what it feels like to live every day with the traumas of the world.
Yeah. So somebody is asking about there's a question about how much of the story is autobiographical. And I think the allure of asking a question like that to me comes from how real the story feels. Like you connect with Gifty so much that you're just like, this story is coming from a personal place. So I'm definitely feeling that question, how much of it?
Yeah, there's been a lot more of this question for this book than there was for Homegoing, obviously. And I think there are several reasons for that. One, the first person nature, but also two, I did want it to have the feel of memoir. And I was reading a lot of what I call like kind of science-y memoir hybrids. So nonfiction books like When Breath Becomes Air, or Atul Gawan's Being Mortal, or even Eula Biss's On Immunity, I think kind of falls under this area. So I was borrowing a little bit from memoir. So there's that. But in terms of what parts of me are in this novel, I think there are two ways to talk about that. One is place, which is important to me in all of my work. I think I'm a person who's really interested in how where we are from and where we live impact our thoughts, our actions, our beliefs. As someone who moved around quite a lot when I was a child, I'm keenly aware of the fact that this country is massive, and the way that somebody who grows up in Alabama sees the world might not be the same as the way somebody who grows up in California sees the world. So place is hugely important to me, and I chose to set this book in places that I know well, which is Huntsville, Alabama, where I grew up, and Stanford, California, where I went to undergrad. And then the other aspect of this book that I would say borrows from my personal life is that I, like Gifty, was raised in the church. I grew up Pentecostal. And it's something that I circle in a lot of my fiction. Certainly in Transcendent Kingdom, it's most fully on display. But there's some grappling with religion and homegoing as well, particularly Akwia's chapter and questions about the role of colonialism in religion in West Africa. But this book, I think, is more interested in the kind of isolation that one can feel as the sole Black person in a predominantly white church, given the fact that religion is practiced very differently in this country, depending on what race you are, what class you are, where you live, all of those factors. So that's something that I think about a lot, and that is something that appears in this book.
Okay, I'm happy you mentioned the Pentecostal upbringing, because I actually was going to ask if there was any autobiographical aspect to that. And in part because I also grew up in kind of an English, a Christian sectarian world that was very much militant in that way, and in the way that it encountered the Bible and what the scriptures meant. And one thing that struck me about Gifty's life is that it never left her.
Yeah.
That even when she substituted the faith in science, right, for this faith that she's carried all through her life, it still continues to be there. Everything she becomes is predicated on that. It keeps coming back, coming back. So I'm curious about, why did you choose to think of those things as a tension? Why is it that one, her faith in science does not completely substitute her faith or her being drawn to religion? Why did you want to explore that tension?
Well, I was thinking about religion in Gifty's life as, in a few ways. One, it is the way that she communicates with her mother, who is more devout than she is, and grew up with a kind of different and almost like more expansive understanding of faith. It's Gifty's mother who tells her that, if you live a holy life, a good life, everything you do can be prayer. And this is, I think, one of the ways that Gifty learns to inhabit the world, to think of the world, that her goodness is kind of an act of faith. The other way that I was kind of thinking about religion in Gifty's life is that it's, as it is for so many people, it is the force that kind of allows her to get through some of her difficult times. It certainly is for her mother. And so Gifty relies on faith as a way of kind of thinking through her difficult questions, and also as a way of asking her difficult questions. Right. Braided throughout this novel are Gifty's journal entries, which I think of as just her kind of, they're all addressed to God, and I think they are her way of kind of asking her questions into, the great mystery that is beyond. She's an incredibly curious person, an incredibly kind of interrogative person, and faith feels like a good place to put that. But then she is also the only Black person at this predominantly white church. Her family are the only Black family at this predominantly white church. And that matters for a lot of reasons, but it matters pretty heavily at once her brother starts to succumb to addiction. She recognizes the way that her church sees them as kind of unsavable or beyond help, or that the conditions that they are suffering through are inherent to who they are. And so for her, it's this matter of, okay, if God cannot take this, if God can't take me as I am, then who is God? Like, what does he mean to me? And I think that's when you start to see her turn away from her religion. But if you spend, 3 days a week going to this place, if it's the way that you and your mother communicate, if it's like how you ask all of your questions, if you have like millions of Bible verses memorized, all of that doesn't just go away. It doesn't, she needs somewhere else to place it. And I think science becomes that for her. It becomes like just another way of asking the questions that she has, of investigating these ideas that she has. There's a point in the novel where she says something like, my soul is still my soul. I just don't call it that anymore. And I think that's really what she's grappling with, that this understanding that that the belief that she had when she was a child, the person that she was when she was a child, is not invalid. It's not wrong or something to discard just because she no longer believes the same way. And I think for her to throw it out would be a kind of dishonor to the child that she was. And so she allows all of that to come with her in this new place that she is entering in her life.
Yeah. And I think it also makes her actually a better scientist and a less hubristic scientist, in the sense that she never then replaces science as the new God. Because anytime she gets sucked into her research, there's some kind of force or language of faith that comes in to say, well, science does not necessarily account for everything, right? Or science may be able to account for a lot, but science cannot account for why I am in awe of this thing, right? Cannot account for why it's mysterious. That there's always something that science cannot quite account for, and that even though faith cannot necessarily account for it, but faith creates a space for you to be able to confront that thing. So it's like, it actually makes her, I think, a much more, as you put it at the beginning, a kind of spectrum thinking person, where she's never caught in this pure binaries.
Yeah, absolutely. There's the point where she says, the brain could teach her where or sometimes how something is happening. It can't tell her why. It can't always tell her why. And I think that speaks to what you're saying. It's this unwillingness to have everything exist in opposition to each other.
And I don't know, I think that's a very a great space to be as you're reading the novel, because you can see the novel's repeated refusal to just resolve things, right? We let's stay with these tensions. Let's throw in as many correspondences or juxtapositions or oppositions, but we are always going to always just exist in that space where they are always in tension. I love that about the story. I'm thinking of, binaries, oppositions, Transcendent Kingdom, the idea of transcendence, right? Could you tell us about that? I don't want to ask what is the Transcendent Kingdom. But I would like to know, what is that notion doing for this story?
Well, so the title comes from a very specific place, which is this moment early on in the novel. Gifty tells us that she had a high school teacher who used to say that humans were the only animals to believe that they had transcended their kingdom. And she's talking about, animalia, like kingdom, phylum, class, order, that kind of a kingdom. But I think Gifty really internalizes this idea, and it encapsulates for her what she loves about humans, but also I think the reasons that she does this work, which is that, as she often says, like, we don't know what we don't know. Like, all we are doing is attempting to kind of, again, like, throw these questions out, ask these questions that are trying to get closer to the mysteries of the universe, and we can't hit it. But the transcendent questions, these questions that are trying to get us closer to something, are for her, I think, a value system. So I think transcendence operates in a couple of ways here. It's like her understanding of religion, of kind of the transcendence of like the holy, of the spiritual, but it's also about like humans as this creature who is of the animal world, but also not quite. And so I think that's important to her and her work.
Yeah. And I mean, I suppose humans can imagine themselves as transcendent, right? As transcending their inclusion in the animal world, right? Like you said, they are both animals, but there's something more, right? But then except you are an addict, for instance, right? And then suddenly you are excluded from that type of world. You're sort of you become your body. You become kind of reduced and enclosed in your body, because now, like the Gifty says, she puts it beautifully. You have no control over what you can or cannot control.
Exactly.
But she's talking about the mice too. So can you tell us what is happening in the animal world of this narrative? Because you have the mice, and then you have Nana, her brother, who is battling with heroin addiction. And then you have all these animals that pop up from nowhere. Her mother's nickname in her diary is Black Mamba. And then at some point, Gifty is like an animal prayer warrior of some kind. Raised for her friends' pets.
Yeah.
So can you talk about the animal aspect of the fictional world?
Yeah, absolutely. I loved what you were saying earlier about these moments where we kind of recognize that we can't control everything, you know, and that we are in fact animals. I in college, I was a part of a poetry group, and we would meet every Sunday, and we would do these long check-ins, is what they were called, but we would just kind of talk about just anything that was on our minds and things that we were thinking about. And I remember this one day, somebody posed the question, like, can you name the times in your life where you felt most like an animal? Like when you kind of lost that sense of yourself as, again, like transcending the kingdom. And like one of the members who was a recovering addict talked about her addiction as being like that moment where she understood herself as kind of an animal. But there were other things like pregnancy or like giving birth, or all these times where you realize we are continuous with everything on this earth, in the words of Ulysses. But yes, going back to the animals that appear in the novel, there's an experiment that Gifty does that I borrow from my friend's research. And I call it the lever press experiment, but basically Gifty teaches these mice to press a lever. And when they do so, there's a little straw, and Ensure floods the straw. The mice love the Ensure, they keep pressing the lever, and then Gifty changes the conditions. So sometimes when they press the lever, they get Ensure, but other times they get a mild foot shock instead. And some of the mice kind of quickly learn to stop pressing the lever because they don't want to incur the risk of these shocks, but other mice do not. And they keep pressing the lever. And she says that these are the mice that she's interested in. These are the mice that she kind of separates in order to study addiction. And I think she becomes kind of fixated on or attached to this one mouse in particular, who seems particularly driven to press the lever. And Gifty is a character who is often kind of protesting the idea that the work that she does has anything to do with her own personal history. She's very good at compartmentalizing, but we know as readers that the reasons that she's interested in these mice, the reasons that she thinks about their kind of inner lives, is because of her brother. And so I think the novel is attempting to, again, kind of draw these linkages between all of these creatures on the planet who are experiencing the world in their kind of animal bodies and their drives, regardless of the kind of stigmas that we put around people who are suffering from addiction, that they are, as Gifty writes about in this novel, or talks about in this novel, that as we see representations of often, the stigma that says that they are weak-willed, that they just don't have the drive or the goodness to to combat their illness, to combat their addiction. Gifty, I think, is trying to locate this addiction within this organ, the brain, because she understands that, like every other animal, we are subject to our bodies. And this particular addiction that befalls her brother, opioid addiction, is one that rewires the brain. So she's interested in our kind of animal natures, and whether or not those are compatible with ideas of choice, and will, and also I think just goodness, inherent goodness.
Right, morality, right? As if,
Right.
it's it's because you're bad, and stuff like that. Let's look at some of the questions coming in. Someone says, I was struck by some of the similarities between your book and Brandon Taylor's real life, set at UW-Madison, Black PhD students from the South in the hard sciences in a very non-Black environment, the lab setting and so on. Have you read Brandon's novel, and why did you put Gifty in that setting?
I haven't read Brandon's novel, but I've heard about it, and yes, and at some point I would like to read it. But I put Gifty in this setting well, to start, I'll say that one of the reasons that I wanted to write about this field in particular is because my own dear friend from childhood is a neuroscientist. She studies the neural pathways of reward-seeking behavior. And I was really fascinated by her work and wanted to kind of see if I could build a story around it. But she is also one of the few women in a field that is dominated by men. And that has an impact on, I think, both how she approaches her work, but also just what is expected of her, but also, more importantly, I think, the kinds of questions that she might ask in her work. And I think this is really gets to the heart of the fact that culture and science are really inextricable. We think of science as being kind of like empirical, set on this scale that can't be touched. But in fact, the questions that scientists are asking are really influenced by who they are, where they come from, what they're interested in. Not all scientists, but for many. So I wanted to have a novel that's centered around a Black scientist, a woman scientist, who had a very different kind of cultural heritage and background from her colleagues. And I wanted to explore how she experienced this difference, but also explore the things that she might notice because of this difference that her colleagues are not noticing.
Thank you. Thank you for that. You mentioned Gifty's journal at some point, and I don't know, there's something about a character that writes, so to read a character writing, and to read a character writing something so personal, and to read a character who is a little Black girl, writing, there's something about that image. Can you speak a little bit more about, and I know that you started talking about this, what it means to imagine a character who kind of lives through writing, and for somebody so young?
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about the journal as a way of really just approaching Gifty from a different angle, because again, she is a character who is incredibly reticent. She's a really guarded character. And in many ways, I think she qualifies as an unreliable narrator. Not unreliable because she's lying to you or like purposefully leading you astray. Like, she's not a Humbert unreliable narrator, but I think she is unreliable in that there are so many areas of her life that she puts walls up, that she won't even kind of articulate those moments to her colleagues. She won't articulate those moments to lovers. When asked about her personal life, or when anyone tries to approach her personal life, she immediately kind of shuts down. and this is in particular when dealing with her brother and his passing. And so one way to kind of see around that was to include these journal entries, which are, I think, Gifty at her rawest and also often at her most honest. And I think part of the honesty comes from the fact that she is, as you mentioned earlier, she's using these code names. So her mother is never her mother, the Black Mamba. Her brother is never Nana. He's Buzz. And I think for a character who is so interested, even at that young age where she's keeping this journal, in compartmentalizing, in kind of manicuring her life to look to outsiders as being even keeled, I think of what we called at my undergrad, we called this the like paddling duck syndrome, where on the surface you seem very placid, and then underwater your legs are like going like that. That's what Gifty looks like to me. She's so interested in kind of keeping this image of her kind of togetherness. And when we see her in these journal entries as a child, we see those places where she didn't have control, where she wasn't able to kind of tidy up the narrative. We see these like naked moments of just of her vulnerability. I think it's important for us to get to see that, but also important for her to have a place where she gets to experience that vulnerability, because she does live in this family that is often not emotionally available with one another. So these journal entries are the place where she is afforded that opportunity to be a child, to say the wrong thing, and to not get it right. And she's a character, as she would say, as she does say in this novel, who is very interested in being right.
Yeah. I mean, I kept wondering, are these prayers, are these letters? I like that they're addressed to God. It's not just like a typical teenage diary, and they're beautiful. We're sort of drawing to the close of our conversation, and we're going to take one more questions from the chat. But before that, I was delighted by the fact that you mention Ama Ata Aido's changes. When I saw that, I'm like, yes. You have a quote from Essie, and you also mentioned Ben Okri's novel, Stars of a
New Curfew.
Stars of a New Curfew. When I read novels, I'm always thinking about the kinds of books circulating around the novels. So what's the novel in conversation with? What other texts or libraries does the novel bring with it? And I loved that there were African texts in there. How do you see your work in relationship to African literary archive, right? So if we place this work or your writing, and we place Aido one way and we place Ben Okri on the other side, what kind of conversations are going to take place between these texts?
Yeah. That's a good question. I think growing up for so long, the only West African writers that you ever heard mentioned in the schools that I went to, was Achebe. It was like Achebe and no one else, as though he was the only person who ever wrote a book in Africa. But I grew up with a father who's a professor and who specializes in Francophone African literature. And so I was always understanding the canon that was being given to me was not the full story. But then as I started to read more African literature in my older years, I still also recognized this absence on the bookshelf, in my opinion. What was an absence on the bookshelf, which was the representation of like my experience of my Africanness, which is not going to be the kind of fully immersed world of an Adichie, or the fully immersed world of even someone like Nobuyo Rosa Shuma, like the people who had grown up in their home countries or had kind of later immigrated to America in their teen or late 20s or beyond. That anytime, and for a while, it kind of kept me from feeling as though I had permission to write about Ghana or to write about Ghanaians. Like I would write these stories when I was a child, when I was in high school, that were very like just kind of divorced from any markers of ethnicity or race or anything like that, because I didn't know if I was like allowed to write about Ghana or write about Ghanaians. And so I think if I were to kind of place myself within the bookshelf that includes all of these writers, it would be at a spot that was attempting to think about the experience of what we sometimes call the 1.5 generation, like these people like me who are straddling the lines between places, who have this knowledge of, experience of, personal relationship to their home countries, but also are very American, and have this kind of this dualness about them. And so both Homegoing, I mean, obviously half of the book is set in Ghana, so it's not quite that task as it is in Transcendent Kingdom, but I think there is still that sense of it, that it's that these books are trying to kind of speak to people who are interested in reconciling race and ethnicity as Black immigrants. So that's where I am, and it's been really nice in recent years to like move past the Achebe only years of my childhood and see other writers like Dinao Mengistu or Nana Kwame J. Bernier, or people who are part of the diaspora, but also have kind of are writing from various distances to the homeland, to the home continent.
That's brilliantly put, and you write beautifully about Ghanaian life. I think the food, you know, just the world, the culinary universe of this novel is wonderful. You know, I found myself being just salivating. I'm like, yes, I know this food. Yes, this makes sense. So I mean, I like the way you framed that. That this is, and it's not even a kind of literature that can be that can snugly fit into the classic immigrant fiction, right? In the sense that it is trying to explore a certain kind of a sense that I am elsewhere, but there's a way it's also rooted. I think, you know, there's a way it captures African life, at least from your perspective, the way you've intimately lived it, you know, and that gives it its own kind of beauty. I think that's you put it really beautifully. We'll take one last question from the chat. Someone says, oh, okay, this is a very, very ambitious, this person is ambitious for you. You always want to be a writer. Do you know what is next? Or are you giving yourself time before starting your next book?
I did always want to be a writer in a certain sense. As I mentioned, I grew up with around books and with parents who were really kind of literary minded, but I didn't really understand that writing was a profession that you could have. It felt like a hobby. It was like this thing that I did on the side that I knew my peers weren't also like writing short stories that they hid in their closets so their brothers couldn't see. But I didn't know what to make of this thing that I was obsessed with doing. I've told this story a lot, so if you've heard it, please forgive me. But the first story that I ever wrote, I wrote when I was 7, for the Reading Rainbow Young Writers and Illustrators competition. And I didn't win the competition, but LeVar Burton signed my certificate and sent it back. And I remember feeling like, okay, this is what I want to do. This is something that I might be good at also. And so that was the kind of the beginning for me. It wasn't until probably around high school that I started to kind of be vocal about my desire to be a writer. And then once I got to college, I was just kind of very single-minded about it. I majored in English with creative writing. I went to grad school a year after. So I think the path was pretty direct. As for what's next, I'm a bit superstitious, so I never really answer this question directly. But I have the seed of an idea, and now that I'm 2 books in, what I recognize about myself is that beginnings are really hard for me, and that the thing that seems like the beginning when I'm starting a project is almost never actually the beginning. So anything that I say about a book at the start of the process will prove to be a lie by the time the book comes out. Okay. So I won't give you much more than that. And I do also think that it's really nice, and not every writer feels this way, obviously. Like, I'm sure Philip Roth was always just working on something back to back to back. But for me, it's really nice to have a fallow period between books. And I do consider that like a kind of work as well. Like, there's something happening even in the in-between time that's hard to articulate, but for me, very necessary for making the book something tangible.
Were you ever concerned about people, about readers wanting another Homegoing? And so not knowing how to take something that is completely different? Was that ever kind of something that you thought about?
You know, I was, but I also wasn't. Like, I felt like in some ways it was like damned if you do, damned if you don't. Like, there's no way to satisfy everyone with a second novel when you've had a first book that was so beloved, like wonderfully beloved, that there would always be these comparisons made. And so in that way, I think it gave me a kind of freedom to just try whatever I wanted to try, because at the end of the day, Homegoing still exists as this contained thing, and the people who love it and wish that I had written a book that was exactly like it can still return to it. And now I get this new feeling, this new book that is speaking hopefully still to some of the people that that Homegoing spoke to, but also to new people as well. So I think anytime you're taking on a second novel, you're kind of at this place of uncertainty, where people have come to expect a certain thing from you, and what you make of that, what you do of that, is really yours. So it was, for me, it was a great pleasure to stretch these new muscles, to work in a way that challenged me to try something different, to think about craft in a different way. And I think what it has left me with is this understanding that really there is a lot of freedom on the page. And so whatever I want to do next, if I just kind of follow my curiosities, follow the story where it wants to take me, I feel at liberty to do that. And so I'm glad that I wrote something different from Homegoing.
That's wonderful. And I'm glad that you did too. And to write something, not just for the sake of writing something different, something that is genuinely beautiful in its own way. I didn't know what to expect. I actually didn't read any blurb before I read the book.
Okay.
And so, and sometimes I purposely just do that because I just want to be surprised. And as I was going through, I'm like, yeah, this is exactly how you do it. You explore this completely different thing, but in a way that people who love your work can recognize. It's legible. It's Yaa Gyasi, like you have your signature, it's all over it, you know?
Yeah.
Your brilliance, everything, every reason why we fell in love with you in Homegoing is in there. But we are seeing it do something completely different that we've never seen. And I think that that's beautiful. It's really gorgeous work.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing the space with me, and for and being generous with your responses to our audiences. And I'm wishing you all the best as you begin all the publicity and promotions around the book. It's gorgeous.
Thank you. This was wonderful. Thank you all for your questions as well.
I just wanted to jump on and say thank you to Yaa and thank you to Ainehi. What a wonderful conversation. I think it was a fantastic way to start the fall celebration, and thank you so much for being here tonight. We return on Monday with Paul Begala talking to David Marinus about his new book, You're Fired, a citizen's guide to getting rid of Donald Trump. But this was wonderful. There's still a couple of books left, so if you want to, you can reserve your copy at the bottom of the screen. Yeah, thank you so very much. And Ainehi, thank you as well.
Thank you. Thanks.